Once a month, my good friend Andrew and I go to the local pub after work to eat a burger, drink a beer, and talk shit while watching a Friday night footy match. Australian rules. Football. We watched the Brisbane Broncos versus Melbourne Storm game tonight. As Queenslanders, both Andrew and I, of course, were rooting for the Broncos. We ordered food before the game started. Andrew was eating steak, and I was having a wood-fried pizza, and we both enjoyed the light meal, finishing off our second pint of beer. More precisely, I was enjoying a pint of beer while Andrew sipped a soft drink since he was on duty today. He was a senior constable at our local police station, having been transferred 6 months ago from headquarters after an unpleasant divorce. I was a lawyer, had just found a good partner, was married to the love of my life, and considered myself a generally good guy despite my profession. Andrew and I were arguing about strategy or lack of it when knocking the ball out in the wrong half of the field when he got the call. "Sorry, buddy," Andrew said to me a minute later, putting down the phone. "I have to go." "Will we meet next Friday?" he asked. I waved him off when he tried to hand me $50 to pay for the meal. "Don't worry about it," I said. "Bring a bottle of something nice to me next Friday night when we're watching the Cowboys take down the Tigers." He grinned, put the money back in his pocket, picked up his jacket, and looked at me seriously. And then his gaze lingered for a moment on something over my shoulder. "Just be careful. I take it you noticed that jock watching you? He's been staring at you since he came in 5 minutes after us." I nodded, taking a sip of beer. "Yes, he's not taking his eyes off me," I replied. "I know he's damn attractive and all, but he's definitely not my type." Andrew laughed. "Don't strain yourself. Joe will have your back if you need help," he said, nodding towards the bartender who had known us for several years. I didn't turn or look, but I could guess that Joe also nodded back at Andrew. A minute later, Andrew left the pub, and I leaned back in my chair with a mug of cold beer and concentrated on the game. In my experience, Australian football is a pretty unique game when it comes to national sports. They don't lash out like they do in American football, and the sides are pretty much set up for most of the game. This is a full-contact sport in which teams completely fight in two 40-minute halves. Today's game was very intense. Melbourne had home field advantage and performed significantly better than the Broncos this season. But tonight, I was hoping we could pull the game off, as the Broncos were on a roll. They were currently ahead. I was watching the kick from the 5th point, which Melbourne was executing from its own 20-meter line, when the guy who, as Andrew noticed, was watching me, sat down in the place vacated by Andrew. In the evening, we chose a place in the center of the pub, ideal for 2 people to eat, and Andrew called the guy a jock, and that's what he looked like. He looked like he was one of those guys who worked out at the gym 3 times a day, pushing his body to the extreme. He had bleached blonde hair, no neck was out of the question, and even when he was relaxed, the veins on his arms were clearly visible, as if he had been training for the last 3. I gave him a cursory glance, noting the tight white t-shirt as he sat down with his tonic water, most likely a mixture with gin or vodka, and I tried not to snort at the side of the stereotypical typical dumbass, continuing to watch the game. I cursed as I watched my team fumble with the ball, which led to a forward pass and penalty against them. "You know, I'm using it," the jock suddenly said without any introduction. He wasn't watching the game or anything around, completely focused on me. I looked at him sideways. "Excuse me?" I asked, as if I hadn't heard. "You heard me," he said, with a big grin on his face. "I told you that I'm using your wife, and she likes it." I was silent for a moment, looking into his eyes. All he did was grin back at me. Oh, and he flexed one of his biceps. It's not such a subtle hint that he'll wipe the floor with me if I try to do anything. I stared at him for a moment longer, until the noise of the game distracted me. The Broncos had just made a great breakthrough and came within 20 meters of where they could make an attempt. I chuckled, a little disgusted. "Nice try, asshole." I returned my full attention to the game and took a sip of beer. "It's true," he said, grinning at me again. "Your beautiful red-haired wife. You know, the one with the shiny blue eyes and the beautiful freckles that run down her back. Or how about I tell you about the little tattoo? Twin dolphins jumping over the moon on her left hind shoulder blade." His statement made me take my mind off the game and look at him. He smiled triumphantly, realizing that he had my attention. Yes, my wife has such a tattoo. All right, asshole. I asked him, what do you want? Now he was smiling like a conquering hero, and I was looking at him like a used piece of gum stuck to the sole of my shoe. But the jock didn't notice my gloomy gaze. I heard the groans of the other visitors and cursed when the Melbourne Storm made a break, running almost the entire length of the field, scoring 4 points right under the posts, bringing the score between the two teams within each other's attempt. It was really a close game, just that I'm going to take her away from you. He told me, essentially still not caring at all about the game. Just for that, I'll take her away from you. His statement made me think about Janie, the hours we spent making love, how I loved looking into those deep blue eyes as her legs wrapped around my waist, and she milked me with all her might. The more I thought about her, the more I smiled at the description of the pitching, the feeling of ecstasy that I felt at the thought of my wife. Unlike the jerk, I've known my wife since 4th grade, when her family moved to the area. A week after she started school, we became best friends. Our mutual attraction was too strong to ignore. When puberty came and hormones kicked in, it was a matter of course that we started dating. Our families didn't mind, offering only symbolic resistance to our budding romance. I still remember the day Janie and I gave ourselves to each other, the awkwardness of our bond despite months of touching and exploring each other. It was crazy. Late at night, somewhere in the backyard, afraid that we would be caught, and the knowing look our parents gave us over the next month. These memories were precious to me, to her. This guy had no idea about it. I remembered how this event brought us closer together. Since then, most of the time, you couldn't even squeeze a piece of paper between us, even when we were both at university. We were both single-minded individuals. I went to law school, and Janie went to be a nurse. But that didn't stop our affection for each other at all. I remembered our wedding, that amazing day when Janie and I officially belonged to each other. Our families celebrated this union. Then I thought about some of our recent problems. But I don't think we've lost our love. If anything, I think we've become closer. I remembered our last argument and smiled. Janie started to undress, and I asked her what she was doing. Then she told me to undress too, because our opinions clearly did not coincide. I barely hid a smile at her demand. The sight of my wife's nakedness never stopped provoking a reaction in me, and she knew it. Janie had a rule that we had to argue naked, because then nothing would be hidden. I smiled absently as the jock watched me, not knowing that I was remembering the discussion and what happened after our disagreement ended. He apparently got tired of waiting and snapped his fingers in front of my face for a good 10 seconds before it brought me out of erotic memories and brought me back to the present. When my eyes focused, I smiled at the man who proudly claimed to be using my wife. I watched as he lost his temper a little, not expecting such a reaction. So I said, taking another sip of beer, "How do you know that the woman you are using is my wife?" She fussed a bit while we were sitting in chairs in the pub after my answer, and then straightened up as if preparing for a fight. "I saw you driving around town with her last Friday." He told me almost dejectedly, as if it was unusual for Janie to see me, her husband. "You two were right next to me at the traffic lights, laughing with the windows down in your fucking Mustang, joking like you didn't give a damn about the whole world. It made me royally angry when you left, and she didn't even look in my direction to see me in my much nicer Mercedes. Right next to you, I watched him aggressively take a sip of his drink. I noticed lime in it. Cute." He smiled when he saw me watching him. Before setting the glass down in front of him with an overly expressive gesture, I started looking at the screen again, not giving him the reaction he wanted. "So I decided to find you and have a little chat," he told me, pretending that I was still looking at him. "I'll let you know that I'm going to launch a massive attack on her, and that there's no way you're going to hold her for long." I almost spilled my already half-empty beer from his comment. Massive offensive. I chuckled and turned to him, ignoring the fact that the Broncos were going to use an attempt to play in the far right corner of the field. "Really?" I said. "What kind of idiot throws words like massive offensive in front of people? You're not some suave Casanova that women beg to take them to bed. Damn, you're not even handsome. A pumped-up drug jerk who thinks too much about himself, spends too much money." He sat with his mouth open for a while, not believing that I had dared to insult him. But I was distracted again by hearing the screams as the Broncos crossed the line. I quickly joined in the applause that rang out in the pub, ignoring the jerk as my team rushed to victory. The jock suddenly jumped up, his face darkened from my indifferent attitude, and he began to pour insults. He was about to reach across the table when I finished my beer and set it down loudly on the lacquered wooden countertop. "Sit down, Cody," I said sharply, suddenly calling him by name. "You don't understand shit, do you?" I said, looking at the confused guy. "My wife loves me and only me. There has never been a place in her heart for another man, and there never will be. We've been together since we were 8 years old, and we'll be together until we're 80. So if you think you have any idea about her, then you're going to be disappointed." "I'm still using your wife," Cody chuckled, trying to regain some of his rapidly diminishing confidence. I stood up and crossed my arms. "I'll pretend I didn't hear that. Actually, I'd be glad if I could pretend that you and I have never spoken, but I can't." I said ominously, "So sit down, shut up, and I'll tell you what happens next." Cody swallowed, fear appearing in his eyes for the first time, but he didn't sit down. "Later in the evening, you will receive a text message saying that you are finished and she never wants to see you again. Then you'll forget that you ever met her. Otherwise, nothing good will come out for you." He took it as a physical threat and continued to stand, trying to appear imposing. If I hadn't looked into his eyes, he might have succeeded, but looking at him, I only saw a bully and I wasn't impressed. I was furious because he was poking his nose where he shouldn't have. "And what are you going to do about it, little man?" "What is it?" he asked sarcastically. Several people in the pub were now looking at us, simultaneously trying to watch the last minutes of the football match that I had missed, thanks to this idiot. Joe looked at me from behind the bar, and I shook my head slightly to let him know that I was okay. Obviously, it was something like David versus Goliath. He was big and strong, but Cody didn't know that I had rocks and a sling. Cody Williams, 29 years old, still lives with his parents in Shorncliffe. I told him in my professional voice. He works as a laborer at Stone & Sons, is engaged to Brianna Phobe. I leaned over and whispered, "Her dad, who owns this place." I smiled and leaned back. Surprise showed on his face. "You see, Cody, I know all about you. I've known about you for a long time. I know your habits, where you work, how you work. I know about 3 women you've dated behind your fiance's back. I know how much money you've spent that doesn't belong to you. I know you think you're a gambler, but for all that, you're afraid Brianna will see you as worthless, lazy shit and dump you. You're worried about keeping her in the dark so that you can use her money to keep buying the illegal steroids that you're pumping into your body." Cody took a step back. His body language told me he was panicking right now. "Now you have to understand, Cody, that although I know a lot about you, you obviously don't know anything about me." I told him calmly, "You see, I'm a lawyer. I specialize in criminal law. I help put bad guys in jail. I always know the bad guys when I see them," I said, looking into his eyes. "And I'll know everything about them before I talk to them, or they talk to me." I was silent for a moment, letting my statement sink into the skull of the pumped-up buffoon in front of me. He still had nothing to say. He was worried as the conversation continued to go downhill for him. "So let me give you some advice." I continued sarcastically, "You have to do what is said in the message that you will receive later. Break up with all women, or I'll represent Brianna on a pro bono basis when she takes what's left of your pathetic pride." I turned and looked at the screen when the final siren sounded. I shook my head. While I was talking to this idiot, the Broncos lost by conceding just 1 goal. Annoyed by the loss and the idiot who kept me company, I grabbed my jacket from the back of the chair and threw it over my shoulders, looking at the stunned jerk opposite while I slipped my arms into the sleeves. I waved to Joe at the bar and walked around the table, stopping right behind Cody, who was now sitting dejected and knew that the conversation hadn't gone the way he thought it would when he sat down. "Do as the message says, Cody," I repeated with a note of menace in my voice, "or I'll make sure you spend the next 3 to 5 years behind bars. Next time, know who you're making love to before you pretend that you're more than just the trash that you are, and just hope that you and I never have to talk again." Then I went out to the second most important thing in the world for me, my cherry red 2022 Mustang, and drove home with a smile on my face. 15 minutes later, I went home, Janie was sitting at the table reading a booklet, one of a stack of booklets in front of her. I walked over, smiled, and kissed her. Sighing, she wrapped her arms around my neck and clung to me as our tongues greeted each other. When I got up to catch my breath, I sat down heavily in the chair next to her, realizing that I needed to talk to her. How was the game? Did you and Andrew have fun? She asked me. Andrew didn't finish watching. He was called to work. I told her the Broncos lost by 1 goal in the last minutes. I'm sorry, baby. They will recoup next week. The finals are still a month away. My wife said, comforting me. And what kind of conversation was that? I looked at her inside. Cody William decided to introduce himself to me today. So we had to talk a little. Oh, Janie said, looking at me sadly. I'm sorry, my love. I was hoping it wouldn't come to this. I nodded. I know, but the job is done, and we talked. I told him what was going to happen. Now you can send a message. Janie nodded, picked up the phone and typed for a minute, then pressed the send button and put the phone back on the table. I'm sorry, she said, and I nodded sadly. If I could have looked into her mind at that moment, I would have seen how upset she was, that Cody had bumped into me. The fact that this was the 3rd time it had happened didn't make her feel any better. And I knew she hated it every time it happened. But she loved me, her husband, like life itself, and she knew that I always knew what I was doing. Cody wasn't anything I couldn't handle. Less than 10 minutes later, Janie received the message and frowned at the phone. He doesn't take it very well. My wife told me, sends you 3 letters and is going to make you regret that you were born while he uses your wife in front of you. I shrugged my shoulders. I will submit the documents tomorrow. I hate it when they don't take the easy way out. Janie nodded, and I opened my arms. Pushing back her chair, my wife stood up carefully. I smiled at her pregnant beauty. She sat on my lap and kissed me again while I stroked her swollen belly with my hands. Despite the fact that we are identical twins, my sister has the worst taste in men. My wife said quietly, she needs to stop using you as a crutch to break up with these idiots. I laughed. Actually, I don't think Katie was the initiator this time. I said, referring to her identical twin sister, and even the tattoos they both got as teenagers were identical. Janie hated that her sister kept looking for guys with gym bodies instead of finding a guy with at least half a brain. My sister-in-law has already used me twice as an excuse to break up with guys. He saw you and me driving home from South Bank a few weeks ago. I told my pregnant wife, who would have had amazing abs without a belly, which was already mentioned earlier today. This moment was the second clue that Cody was talking about Katie. And the first one was that I knew my wife, and she would rip his balls off with her bare hands before she would ever cheat on me. He saw us in the Mustang and was angry that you didn't see him in the Mercedes. He thought you were Katie. Then he found me and decided to have a chat. Janie laughed and gave me a smoldering look. You know, I said, changing the subject, Andrew's divorce has been going on for 6 months now. I know he's always been partial to Katie, ever since high school. Maybe a barbecue on Saturday night. Janie's gaze turned playful as she sensually plucked a stray piece of cotton from the shoulder of my shirt. You never know. Stranger things happen, my wife replied, while we were both amazed when the push of a small hand reminded us of the life inside her stomach. Oh, she said, leaning forward and kissing me again. But this, she said to me, touching the little hand in response, until it disappeared back into her, is your fault. Come and take responsibility for this. Then my wife got up and moved towards the bedroom, swaying her hips sensually. I smiled when she winked back at me and followed the most beautiful ass in the world. Katie's male problems can wait.